If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description. Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200 plus audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.
Chapter 1, Birth and Abandonment. Long Island Community Hospital, 11 p.m. Unknown POV. Aic. I screamed while hearing the rushing nurses and the doctor yelling me to push. I answered him, "What do you think I am doing, you ducking cunt?" Aic. My own yelling interrupted by my scream. "Up the epidural." The doctor yelled, "Yes please, up it, up it." My screams continued, each contraction providing an even greater amount of pain. Who knew giving birth was so ducking painful? Finally, after 2 more hours of this intense pain and pushing, I heard a cry, a loud beautiful cry. A nurse took my baby and I saw him from my bed as he was rinsed and the blood was washed off him, but something felt off. The other nurses couldn't stop gossiping amongst themselves, and if I hadn't been this exhausted I could have probably heard what they were saying. After what felt like an eternity, my newly washed son was passed on to the doctor, and as he approached me, my baby still crying in his arms, he seemed to be filled with a look of pity and fear came over me. I couldn't help but ask, "Is he okay, doc?" The doctor kept quiet and just passed my crying son to me, which I gladly took in my arms, and as I looked at him I noticed everything about him: his small wiggling toes and fingers, his head 4 sizes too big, a small gift of black hair on his head, and his eyes, they were completely white. At that exact moment the doctor said, "Edna, your son is in perfect health except for what you could have already guessed, he's blind." The doctor then looked at my face as if I wanted to say something, but I just told everyone to leave to get some time alone with my son. "You truly look like your father," I said, tracing my hand around his head, tears starting to fall of my eyes. "I love you so much," I whispered to his ear, "more than you will ever know." At that exact moment he stretched his hand out, gripping one of my fingers with his baby hand, and sadness overcame me once again. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," I whispered again, tears still falling from my eyes and yet a small smile forming on my face. I steadied my breath and left my sheets, starting to get up, my legs almost giving up on me as I did so after all the strain I had been through, but I knew I needed to be quick before they came. I slowly started walking step by step. It seemed that even my son knew to be quiet at this moment, as he didn't even let a squeak get out of his mouth. I opened my hospital room and quickly starting to get out of the hospital. Each time a nurse accidentally spotted me I quickly snapped my fingers using the mist to conceal myself from them, but even that little amount of effort was grueling. Finally I made it out of the hospital, where my fully prepared car lay waiting for me in my parking spot. I quickly made it to the car and strapped my son into the seat I had prepared beforehand and changed myself into more comfortable clothes and strapped my dagger. At that exact moment I felt them getting closer, the mist itself telling me of their arrival. I didn't know what they were, but if they caught us in the state I was in now, no, I couldn't think like that, I couldn't let that happen. "Ready to go for a ride, my little one?" I asked my son on the back seat as he giggled at me. As good answer as any, I struck my foot to the accelerator and started driving, full speed ahead. I knew I was a short journey from Camp Half-Blood, even if I hadn't been there in a lot of years, but still I knew I could make it there. After half an hour of stressful driving I felt it again, monsters, this time closer than ever before. Suddenly things started crashing against us from all sides. The car seemed to be a bumper, and yet I stayed on my path trying to keep myself on the road, but then I heard a sudden pop and we started spiraling out of control. Skrrrrrr crash. As we spun frantically we hit something, making it yelp like a wounded dog after the spinning stopped. I quickly turned to my son and said, "Well, that was a close one, but let's get out of here." I stepped out of the car and saw a haunting sight, one I hadn't seen since the days of Camp Half-Blood. 3 lucrocatas with the body of a stag, the neck of a lion, cloven hooves, and a wide mouth with a sharp, bony ridge in place of teeth. One of them seemed to be limping, probably the one I had hit when the car had spun out of control. I quickly opened the door where my son was seated and put him inside my backpack while telling him to keep silent. "Edna Atonal, daughter of Aphrodite, you have an awfully good smell on you," one of them hissed in a human-like voice. "Yes, your smell is as strong as teen half-bloods. Weird we weren't able to catch it before the past 2 months," another one said. "Well, I am beautiful, isn't it normal that I smell good?" I replied jokingly as I slowly walked away, since my strength had mostly returned in the car drive. "We guess so," the limping lucrocata said. "It seems pleasantries are over, so bye-bye," I finally replied and started running as fast as my half-godly legs could carry me. The lucrocatas were quick to follow after me. I didn't know how far I was from Camp Half-Blood, but I knew I was probably close enough if the forest I was in was any indication. As I ran through the forest, the relentless pursuit of the lucrocatas at my heels, I knew I had to think fast. My son was on my back, weighing me down, but I couldn't leave him behind. Finally, with no other options left, I threw my son's bag into a nearby bush in hopes that he would be found by the camp scouts, at least that way my son would stay safe for a longer time. As I kept on running and the monsters closed in, I prayed to my mother as hard as I could and whispered, "Mother, I have never asked you for anything, but please lend me your voice even just once." I yelled at the following Lukrokatas, "Leave me alone." The 3 Lukrokatas seemed to be unaffected as they kept on coming after me, but one of the Lukrokatas was glancing at the bag on occasion, so to keep my son safe I tried another command, "Follow me." That seemed to do the trick, as the 3 Lukrokatas, even the least interested one, lost full control of their bodies and started running after me. I ran and ran as fast as I could. Without the bag's weight I was able to keep a noticeable distance, but they were slowly closing it. Finally, when I couldn't see my bag and I was running low on stamina after running for so long, I stopped running, the 3 Lukrokatas finally catching up and encircling me. "Well, daughter of Aphrodite, it seems you have reached your end," they all said in eerie unison. "I guess so, but I will take at least one of you with me," I replied with snarky determination. Drawing my dagger as quick as lightning, I prepared myself for the fight ahead. All of them lunged at me at once, but without my son on my back I could finally move like a demigod was made to move. I ducked under their lunges trying to slice them, but they were able to quickly move their bodies away from my knife, its celestial bronze shining in the night. Their coordinated attacks continued wearing me down further, although I was trying my hardest it truly seemed as if I couldn't escape my end. So I decided to do what I was taught. The best way to get an opening was to create one yourself. I left my leg as bait when dodging one of the Lukrokatas and they bit on it as hard as they could. I smiled and plunged my dagger into its head, its body falling to the ground dead, Tartarus taking it back where it belonged. "You will pay for that, you bitch," one of the Lukrokatas snarled. I only smiled at that and readied my dagger again. As the remaining 2 lunged at me I decided to dodge them, but my bitten leg seemed to fail me as they were able to bite one of my arms off, my blood spraying everywhere. They lunged at me once again faster than ever, my depleting blood slowly making me lose consciousness, but I still had the strength for one last move as one of the Lukrokatas bit my neck. I drew all my strength into one swing and decapitated it. The other, however, was still able to bite my undamaged leg, ripping it off, and I fell to the blood-soaked ground. The last remaining Lukrokata lunged at my fallen body and started tearing into my stomach, eating me alive. I tried stabbing it on any spot that I could, but it seemed to do nothing as my eyes slowly closed and everything faded to darkness. I couldn't help but think, "Nice to see you so soon, my love." Unknown POV. "Sir, we have something," one of the newer scouts yelled at me, as he signaled me to come over. I trotted close to the bush, my armor clanking against my skin, and on it was a yellow, mountain climbing backpack. It seemed to be stuffed with a lot of things by the shape of it. I ordered everyone, "Draw your weapons and keep a close attention on the bag, I will open it." The scouts did as indicated and drew their spears, blades and other weapons. I slowly approached the bag with caution, which might have been weird for a normal person, but you never knew with demigods. I crouched before it and started unzipping it a bit. It seemed to be harmless, so I opened it fully, and inside of it was probably one of the weirder sights I had seen ever since I was taken into this world. A small baby with a tuft of black hair covered in sheets was peacefully sleeping with his eyes closed inside of it. "Sir, what is it?" one of the Hermes kids asked me with greed evident in his voice. "It's a baby," I replied. My companions all showed the same face I had made when I first saw it. We were all perplexed, no befuddled by these events. "Well, what should we do?" an Apollo kid questioned me. "I guess we should take it to Chiron, he always knows best," I replied. Everyone nodded in agreement, and careful not to wake up the sleeping infant, I grabbed the bag and started moving back towards Camp Half-Blood. The other Ares kids would definitely not believe this. Creator's thoughts. Welp, first chapter down, let's hope for many more. Chapter 2, Adoption and Naming. Unknown POV. As my team and I finally came back to camp with baby in hand, we crossed the barrier that protected the camp, and I told everyone to get back to their cabins so they could rest. I quickly made my way to Chiron and Mr. D's cabin to show them our little find. I walked up the hill and made my way to the deck in the big house, where Mr. D as always seemed to be sipping on his Diet Coke and cursing about one thing of another. I opened the creaking door, and inside of it was Chiron, our teacher, his half-horse body sitting on the floor as he seemed to be reading a book. Chiron seemed to notice my presence as he quickly closed his book and asked me, "Edward, my boy, what seems to be the problem?" Chiron POV. As I sensed someone enter my chambers, I quickly closed my book. I had been reading on the latest slang the demigods seemed to be using, and I turned to look at my visitor. It turned out to be Edward, a burly short Ares kid who was amazing with the spear and had a temperament closer to those from the Athena cabin than Ares. He seemed to be carrying a big bag, probably his latest find, while scouting outside of the barrier walls. As it seemed he had difficulty speaking first, I questioned him in a caring tone. Edward boy, what seems to be the problem? No problem, sir. Edward replied. It's just that we found this while checking the forest perimeter for any monsters. He continued as he handed me the bag, and inside of it was a child, no, a baby. I couldn't help but recall this sight. Even in all my life this had happened only twice or thrice, with one of them being the Argonaut Jason. Leave him here, Edward. I told him as I stretched my arms and grabbed the baby from the bag. What will you do with the baby? Edward questioned me. Don't worry about that, he is a demigod. Since he was able to pass the barrier, so obviously he will stay here. Now come on, go back to your cabin, you deserve some rest. I replied. Edward did as I told him and left the big house. Now I just had one more thing to worry about. What was I going to do about this infant demigod that had landed at my doorstep? As I looked at the demigod that now lay nestled in my arms, I couldn't help but think about their parents, not their godly one but their human one, and so I made a decision I hadn't made in a few centuries. I was going to adopt this sleeping child. At that exact moment the infant seemed to stir from his sleep and his eyes fluttered open, and I couldn't help but think, well, this just keeps getting better. It turns out this kid was blind, at least if his completely white pupils were anything to go by. Still I remained resolute. After all, blindness in Greek mythology could be a gift as much as a curse. I took the baby to one of the extra beds that existed in the big house and carefully laid him there. I started thinking of what to name our newly arrived guest. There were many good names to choose from, and I could either go the ancient route or modern one, but as names had power I decided to go the ancient route. After that I started thinking about Greek names, but most of the people who were blind in our history was because they were punished by the gods. So I decided to move on from that and started thinking about names from Greek heroes, but being the person who HD trained most of them, it just felt wrong. The one who felt the closest was Jason, but that still didn't feel right. I finally fell on a name that felt just right, a hero who had foresight and intelligence, a warrior of the mind, and one of the few who I wasn't able to train but I wish I had. I then looked down to the waking baby. I said in a certain manner, your name shall be Odysseus, son of Chiron. The child, no Odysseus, seemed to form a wide grin after hearing his name, and I couldn't help but form one as well. Creator's thoughts. Short chapter, I know, but the first was almost 2,000 words, so together they make up around 2,800 words, so 1,400 for each chapter. Chapter 3, Raising and Training. 4 years later. Camp Half-Blood, 10 a.m. MCPOV. As I woke up from my bed I escaped the sheets that lulled me to sleep, and grabbed my walking stick at the side of my bed. After some fooling around my bed, I slowly made my way across my room. I first went to the cupboard and changed my comfy pajamas into an orange shirt with Camp Half-Blood written on it, black pants, socks and shoes. No, you may be wondering how I knew what color they were. Well, the simple reason is that I only had that pair of clothes on repeat. After that I walked to my room's door and opened it like I had done so many times before and left my room. I slowly made my way across the big house where I had spent my entire life. Finally I made it to the door I thought was the front door if I had navigated correctly across the house. I opened the door and heard a rough voice call me from the side. Hey, Oliver Seuss, Chiron said that today you will be training archery with the other Apollo kids. Thanks, Mr. D. I replied while letting out a faint smile and slowly making my way to the archery range, which was located behind the Apollo cabin, since they were the ones that used it the most. Not that I could really tell if it was the Apollo cabin, but it was a good landmark to ask for directions from the other campers. Little by little I walked down the hill where my house was and I heard another voice. Oh, Ozzy. The female voice called. Oh no, I though, come on quick, quick, I heard as how the owner of the voice kept coming closer and closer. Suddenly I felt hands grab my cheeks. The same voice said, oh little Ozzy, what were you doing running from me? While stretching my cheeks. I reacted as fast as my demigodly appendages could allow me and separated her hand from my cheeks and replied, no touchy, Emma. While moving my hands around frantically. Oh, don't be like that. Emma, a daughter of Aphrodite, replied, where are you going this fine morning, little Ozzy? Emma continued. Mr. D told me that Dad was waiting for me in the archery range with the Apollo kids. I replied. Well, let your big cousin Emma take you. Emma said with a grin I could see even through my blindness. Fine, could you please take me, Emma? I said while my face scrunched up instinctually. Well then, let's go. Emma said with enthusiasm as she grabbed my hand and started walking at a pretty fast pace, at least for blind kid. As we made our way to the archery range, Emma started talking about her day after waking up and any other small talk she could come up with. We finally stopped walking and hearing the whistling of arrows I could guess we were in the archery range. After that I heard a familiar sound of hooves trotting on the ground as my dad came closer to us and said, "Thank you Emma for bringing Odysseus here, it is much appreciated, but shouldn't you be in the stables right about now?" "Yes Chiron, I just felt like little Ozzy could use some help, so I honorably decided to arrive a little bit late for class in exchange for helping a camper," Emma said in a matter-of-fact way. "Well, then thank you Emma, but come on, get going," my dad said. After that Emma bid goodbye to me and left for what I could only assume were the stables. "Come on Odysseus, follow me, it is time for your first lesson," my dad said. We started walking side by side, and after a few more minutes of walking and hearing arrows leave their bows, we finally stopped walking in silence, and my dad said, "Well Odysseus, you have learned fast when it comes to ancient Greek and English, but you are a demigod at heart and you have to learn how to fight even with your blindness, since sadly a demigod's life is a hard one." "Okay Dad," I replied. "For your first lesson I was thinking of having you learn archery as your main way of fighting, which I know may be controversial, but with enough practice you would be able to hear where your enemies come from and have enough distance to actually do something about it," Dad finished saying as he handed me what I could only assume was a bow, from what I could feel, in a quiver with bows which my dad strapped to my back. "Now when it comes to archery the most important thing is form, stability, and power," Dad said. "Okay," I replied. "For the first few rounds I will help you with drawing an arrow from your quiver and putting it on your bow. I will also help you with your form and where your arrow will fly," Dad said as he grabbed my hand and helped me draw my first arrow and place it on my bowstring. As I got better at drawing arrows, Dad decided to leave me to my own devices and went to help correct the forms of the other campers. And so that is how I spent the rest of the day, not leaving even for lunch with the other campers. While not even one of my arrows was able to reach the target or completely flew past it, from what Dad said I did come close once. I kept on firing arrows one after the other, my quiver replenishing magically by idle safe. I finally heard the bell for dinner time and decided it was time to stop. Since I almost never had dinner with the other campers, I decided to start heading back to the big house for some good old night rest, when suddenly I felt something, no, not felt but saw. A tree nymph seemed to be peeking her head out of her tree and looking at me. I didn't know how I could see her, I just knew I couldn't see her face, or any specific features, just her body and shape. I shook my head at what I was seeing, because I thought I was maybe imagining it. As soon as I stopped shaking my head I couldn't see the nymph anymore. "How weird," I said aloud as I walked up the steps of the big house's front deck and entered the house, then my room, and went to sleep without even changing my clothes from all the exhaustion. Chapter 4, My Sight and Day. 7 months later. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. I continued seeing things and people more frequently. First was the nymphs and the satyrs, then my dad and the practice monsters around camp, then the other demigods around camp, and finally objects started appearing as shadowy figures. I had told my dad about the shadowy figures I could see, and he just replied that it could be an ability of my blindness, but I didn't think that was quite right. As I made my way with the Apollo kids to the archery range, I was driven out of my thoughts by a voice. "Hey, Ozzy." I turned my head and saw a shadowy figure with a slight blue aura around it. "Hey Clark," I replied to the person who the voice belonged to. "Are you ready for practice today?" Clark asked me. "Yeah, I am all warmed up," I replied as Clark and I grabbed our bows and enchanted quivers that replenish our arrows. As Clark and me stood in our form, grabbed an arrow from our quivers, strung our bows to full draw and let it fire. As the arrows flew with tremendous speed, they both quickly reached the targets, Clark's arrow almost completely piercing through the middle of the target and mine struck the inner rim. Clark turned to me and said, "Looks like you are getting better." "Yeah, but I still have a long way to catch up to you," I replied. We both continued drawing our bows and firing our arrows continuously until practice was over. By the end of it my arms were so strained that as soon as the adrenaline stopped flowing through me I couldn't lift them up. As I left my bow and quiver on the practice stands, I started walking to my next session, not before saying goodbye to Clark. My next class, as my dad liked to call them, was Pegasus riding, one of the class I honestly hated the most. As I made my way to the stables I caught up with the group who I took this class with, the Aphrodite kids. A black shadowy figure with a blue aura around her came running at me and yelled in a distinctly feminine voice, "Oh cute little Ozzy." Emma came to me and quickly started pinching my cheeks. As soon as Emma had spoken, the shadowy figures of the other Aphrodite kids started turning to me and yelled, "Oh, cute Ozzy." Then both boys and girls came around me and started pinching my chubby cheeks, but I continued trying to slap them away. I couldn't help but think, seriously, Aphrodite kids are the worst. Our group made our way to the stables with the Aphrodite kids continuing to surround me and touching my face. We finally made it to the stables and the greenery where the Pegasus were kept, and as I watched how the Aphrodite kids approached the shadowy figures of the Pegasi, all PF which had a distinctly grey aura around them. The demigods quickly approached their favorite Pegasi and mounted them. Of the few Pegasi left, I made my way to one, but as soon as it saw me it quickly started running away from me and flying. I couldn't help but sigh at this development, since it always happened whenever I approached them. I started looking around for one Pegasi in particular. I finally found him. He seemed almost exactly the same as the other ones except for the slightly green aura that surrounded it. I made my way to it. With caution it approached me and started nuzzling me with its snout. "Thanks, dude, for always letting me ride you," I whispered as I scratched its mane, and it neighed at me in approval. I then jumped on its back and the Pegasus started running before taking off into the air. I felt the wind in my hair. I tried to control where the Pegasus flew with careful maneuvers, since this was the point of the class. 1 hour later the class had finally finished, and my Pegasus landed on the ground. A shadowy figure with long flowing hair, who I could only presume to be Emma, came to me and said, "Wanna go to the campers' lunch with all of us?" "No, thanks Emma, I will go later, I am gonna go and find Dad," I replied. "Well, have fun then and say hello to Mr. Chiron for me," Emma replied back. I then waved goodbye to everyone from the Aphrodite cabin and they did the same. While making my way across camp, shadowy figures walking around with green and blue auras. I continued walking closer to the big house where Dad should probably be. I climbed the stairs and a voice surprised me. "What are you doing here, kid?" "Og!" I yelled, jumping backwards. "Shouldn't you be at lunch with the other campers?" "Oh, hi Mr. D, I didn't see you." "Yes, I will go later, just came home to talk to Dad for a bit," I replied. "Well, go right in, Chiron should be in there." I opened the door and went in, and I couldn't help but think about Mr. D. For some reason he was the only thing that I hadn't been able to see even once after several months, maybe because of his Olympian status. I walked around the house and heard the clopping of my father's hooves in the attic. I made my way to the attic, and just as I was about to open the door I heard a voice which wasn't my dad saying, "A child of the eldest shall be born." I decided to not think too much about it and said, "Dad." As I knocked on the door, "Yes, son, come in, my dad replied. I opened the door and there was my dad, looking more serious than I had ever seen him. He turned to me and asked me, "What is wrong, son?" "Nothing, Dad, I was just wondering when you will let me fight in spars or capture the flag. I feel like I am ready and I want to improve," I said. "Well, if you think you are ready, I guess I can't stop you," he replied. "I will make a new schedule for you and your lessons." After having a rather long talk with my dad, I left the house and made my way to the lunch fire. There I grabbed my food and threw the best part of it into the fire for the gods, but the entire time I couldn't help but think, what was that voice in the attic? Creator's thoughts. Well, chapter finished, hoped you like it. Chapter 5, My First Spar. Camp Half-Blood, Sparring Ground 1700 hours. After finishing lunch with the other Half-Bloods, my dad approached me. His eyes held a mix of concern and determination. "Come with me," he said, gesturing for me to follow. I glanced at the other camper who stood nearby, their shadowy form being enveloped with a slight green and orange aura. We walked across the camp, the crunch of gravel under our shoes echoing in the quiet afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the training grounds. As we reached the sparring area, I noticed rows of weapon racks, each holding an array of deadly tools. Swords, daggers, bows, choices for the demigods who trained here. I hesitated, my fingers brushing against the hilt of a sword. But when I gripped it, something felt off. The weight was wrong, the balance skewed. I returned it to its place and scanned the racks. My eyes settled on a spear, its shadowy tip catching my eye. Without thinking, I reached for it, and as my hand closed around the shaft, a surge of certainty washed over me. The camper and I approached each other, weapons in hand. "Introduce yourselves," my father said. "I am Odysseus, son of Chiron, 4 years old," I said while directing myself to my opponent's shadowy form. "I am Kevin, son of Ares, 10 years old." My opponent, who identified himself as a son of Ares, said while whirling his blade around in his right hand. My dad nodded at our introductions and lifted his arm upwards, and decisively lowering his arm he yelled, "Start!" As soon as the spar begun, Kevin rushed at me, trying to close the distance so as to make his sword useful. I saw him rushing at me and I jumped backwards. I grabbed my spear with all my strength, and without allowing my feet to move I extended my spear forward, allowing my body to follow the motion. Kevin dodged the spear and quickly closed the distance between us and put the tip of his sword to my throat and said in a calm demeanor, "I won." "Again please," I said, wanting to continue practicing. "Fine," Kevin said as he sighed in exasperation. The next few hours were continued by sparring and losing, over and over. "This is the last one, Ozzy," Kevin said. "We need to go for dinner with the other campers in 30 minutes. As both took our stances and since Dad had left a while ago to deal classes to other demigods. Kevin yelled at the top of his lungs, "Start!" The sparring ground crackled with tension as Kevin lunged at me once more. His shadowy form blurred, and I backdashed, my heart pounding. The lance in my grip felt like an extension of my arm, its bronze head gleaming in the afternoon sun. I struck from a distance, thrusting, but Kevin was relentless. Parry, dodge, parry. Our spar continued, each move calculated, each breath strained. Then, Kevin shifted tactics. His back foot slammed into the ground, and he surged forward with ferocious speed. I knew this move, the one that had bested me before. My pulse quickened. He closed the gap, rendering my spear useless. But instinct kicked in. I pivoted on my back foot, my body twisting, and unleashed a wide slap with my spear. The impact reverberated through my arms as the bronze head connected with Kevin's torso. For a moment, he was sent sprawling backward, the distance between us widening by a meter. But Kevin was no ordinary opponent. He rose swiftly. As I lunged, he sidestepped, his blade slicing through the air. My spear split in twain, the halves falling to the ground. Panic surged, and before I could react, his sword pressed against my throat. I sighed, defeated. "Guess I lost again, hey." Kevin withdrew his blade, his eyes assessing. "You did better this round," he admitted. "That last move of yours, it caught me off guard." His praise warmed me, even as I tasted the bitterness of defeat. He sheathed his sword, striding toward the racks. "Are you coming to dinner or what?" he called over his shoulder, a hint of a smile in his voice, the previous orange and green aura around his shadowy form now completely green. I nodded, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Together, we made our way to the camp's communal table, battle-worn but alive with the thrill of combat. Creator's thoughts. Another short chapter, I know, but hey, that was everything I wanted to write. In this chapter I will make the next one longer. We cool? Yeah, we cool. Chapter 6, Classes from Chiron. 15 months later. Camp Half-Blood, July 16, 1996. I sat on the fields surrounded by the other campers from all the other cabins. I saw my father trot onto the stage, coughed and said, "Cough, cough. Settle down everyone, today for our weekly mythos class we will be talking about locations of known monsters and important points like Olympus." He then continued as he approached a piece of paper strung up between two trees, which, even though I couldn't see the details since I just saw a mass of darkness, I could only assume it was a map. As we covered in last week's lesson, depending on the importance of a nation, important places, monsters, and gods switch to that nation. The United States has been the center of this change since a little before 200 years ago, and thanks to all the quests the demigods have been on, we know most of the important locations or monsters. Firstly, Mount Olympus itself, which changed its location to the Empire State Building. Now on to the more practical knowledge places such as the entrance of the underworld being in Los Angeles, though its location does change slightly each decade. We also have the Garden of the Hesperides in San Francisco. The lecture went on as usual as my dad kept on talking about the known locations of important places from the Greek mythos and monsters, ranging from Gerion's castle located in the island of San Clemente to the Sea of Monsters located in the Bermuda Triangle. After an hour of locations and monsters, the lecture moved into another subject: monsters themselves. "Chiron, sir, how long do monsters stay dead?" One person, who I could only assume was a girl from her long hair and voice, asked my dad. "Well, Christine, it depends mainly on three things. The first is of course what type of monster you killed. The stronger the monster, the longer it will take it to respawn. The second is what way the monster was killed. If the monster was killed with magic or Stygian iron, it will take longer for it to revive than if it was killed by celestial bronze. Also, special weapons have the property of making the monster revive later than usual. The final thing that affects a monster's death and their revival is also luck. The same monster can take up to 3 times as long to respawn even if they were killed the exact same way." The class continued with my dad explaining different monsters and their special abilities, what forms they can take if they use the mist, and even what ways previous demigods killed those monsters. The class finally ended and the group started walking towards the lunch fire. I suddenly felt a strong grasp on my shoulder and I turned my head, the shadowy form of a boy with a green and slightly blue grasping my shoulder. "Hey Ozzy, wanna come eat with the rest of the Aries kids?" I recognized the voice as Kevin and replied, "Sure Kevin." He then went in front of me as he gestured me to follow him from behind, and did as he said. We finally reached a group with a lot of kids, both boys and girls with green and orange hues overlapping them. "Hey, dudes!" Kevin yelled at them, "Sup, Kevin?" Some replied back. The group went on to their lunch table and I mostly stayed silent, just talking to Kevin and some his closer friends which I had some conversations with. As the topic of discussion ranged from one subject to another, the Aries kids suddenly starting arguing which strongest monster they would be able to beat on their own. "I could totally beat the Minotaur by myself," one of the boys said confidently. "Just that, I could beat a Chimera by myself," one of the girls replied back. "Are you nuts?" Some boys asked her. "A Chimera is way too strong for you, its fire breath alone is already a big enough problem, not to mention it is literally called the demigod killer," one boy said in a wild manner as he directed himself to the shadowy mass of the girl. "So Bellerophon was still able to kill one, so I bet I could too," the girl replied. "No way, you are delusional," the boy continued. "So what monsters do you think you could take on a 1v1? A girl from the farther side of the table suddenly asked in Kevin and me's direction. I pointed at myself just to be sure since I couldn't see eyes, so I couldn't tell where she was looking. "Obviously you, I am looking at you, aren't I?" the girl said to my gesture. "If I had to decide on the strongest monster I am able to kill right now or will be able to kill in the future, I guess it would be a Gorgon right now and Orthrus in the future," I said in a definite manner. "Orthrus, not a bad choice," Kevin whispered into my ear. The lunch went on as we continued drinking ambrosia and nectar to our heart's content, while the Aries kids continued arguing about which monster they would be able to kill. Creators' thoughts. Well, hope you liked this chapter. I wanna try and make character relationships better in this story. Chapter 7, Hunters Arrive. 20 days later. Camp Half-Blood, August 6, 1996. The days went on by, we all trained, learned Greek and mythos. As I was drawing my bow, I slowly, carefully, the string putting pressure onto my fingers and my shoulder, I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding. The arrow flew quickly and punctured the center of the range target. 10 to 10, Clark, it seems you can't beat me anymore and this will end in a tie, hey? I said with a conniving smirk. "Don't be so sure, Ozzy." Clark drew a new arrow and started fiddling with the fletching. He then went behind me and said, "Watch this." He let the arrow fly and instead of going straight and hitting me, the arrow started to curve in a way I didn't think was possible. The arrow continued its trajectory and finally hit one of the targets. After the sudden thump of the arrow, Clark said with laughter in his voice, "While you lose a lot of power doing that, it does give points for style." He approached me and placed his hand on my head, which I didn't notice, still fascinated by his skill with the bow, since while that move wasn't useful in an actual fight against a monster because of the loss of power, the sheer mastery to be able to do so was incredible. While still in awe of Clark's technique, a sudden noise interrupted all activities around camp, a horn. It seems someone had come to the camp, and if the loudness of the horn was any indication, they were really important. Clark, me and the rest of the Apollo kids started going back to the cabins following the protocol we were given. As all demigods from all cabins started gathering, I saw a group of shadows huddled together behind my dad with bows and daggers strapped to them. They all seemed to be women if their outline and hair suggested anything, and all of them seemed to have an intense orange aura around them. One seemed to be more orange than shadow, in fact something I had never seen before. Cough, cough, hello everyone. As you can probably see, we have a few new guests with us today. Our guests have come because they have begun a hunt quite close to here. So they will be staying with us a week or two, my dad said. After the introduction, the group of shadowy guests didn't say anything else and swiftly left to unpack their things in the Artemis cabin. It felt a bit weird having the hunters of Artemis staying with us, but I guess it isn't that out of the ordinary since they did come at least once a decade. The day went on as normal. I caught a few glimpses of the archers, which were the only people who still had orange auras in camp. As evening settled in, I returned to the big house, my body weary and craving my comfy bed. Weary, I ascended the porch stairs and mumbled, "Good night, Mr. D," stifling a yawn. "I ain't Dionysus, kiddo. Though I can see how you could make that mistake," a lovely, somewhat young voice said. Reacting on instinct, I quickly put my hands up and dashed at the owner of the voice, throwing a punch with my fastest speed, but it flew straight through. I stayed alert, opening my ears trying to listen to wherever the owner of the voice was since I couldn't see it. You are pretty fast for a 5-year-old, but you really shouldn't attack someone who tutored your father. The feminine voice said. I lowered my fists and almost hit my head with my palm at being so dumb and not figuring out that this person was, not being able to see it, the hunters arriving today. It was obviously, Artemis, but I still had one question. What are you doing here, Artemis? Shouldn't you be with your hunters? Just wondering. I questioned. My hunters can defend themselves if necessary and I like the quietness of the big house more. Artemis replied, I guess that makes sense. I thought. Artemis, I have a few more questions. I said while scratching the back of my head. Lay them on me, kid. She replied, well, my first question would probably be what was Dad like when he was younger? I asked a little nervously. Your dad, hey, Chiron was exemplary if anything else, though I would say that Apollo taught him more than me. We both could see he would be great when he was older and he obviously was. I mainly tutored him in archery and while he is now praised for being one of the best archers in history, you should have seen him when he first started. His hand coordination was awful and he never knew when to release the arrow. Artemis said with a slight laugh in her voice. Really, was there anything else he was bad at? I asked excitedly, wanting to get more dirt of when Dad wasn't as good as he was. Well, nothing truly came easily to him, he just practiced a lot and had some talent in a lot of different fields. If I could describe him, he was first a jack of all trades and then a master of all. Artemis said with some reminiscence in her voice. We both continued talking a lot more, mainly about my dad's younger days and his awkward phases. I finally bid goodbye to Artemis and went to sleep. Creator's thoughts. Hope you liked this chapter. I honestly really liked writing this chapter. Chapter 8, Hunters Against Half-Bloods. Camp Half-Blood, August 7, 1996. As I woke up from my bed, I started preparing myself for today's classes, by doing some morning stretches to get rid of yesterday's soreness. I went towards the closet and grabbed my camp shirt and black pants. I left the big house, and went for the common breakfast with the other demigods, something I had started doing a few months ago. As I approached the masses of darkness and silhouettes of the campers at the tables again, the hunters of Artemis stood out with their entirely orange aura encircling they. Hey Ozzy! I heard a feminine voice which turned my attention away from the hunters. I recognized the voice almost instantly and dashed backwards as the hairs of my neck stood on their end. Then a shadowy outline with long hair and blue aura tackled the spot where I was previously on. Emma, no, stay there! I said in a warning voice. Emma didn't seem to heed my warning as she suddenly tackled at me again, but I started running away from her as fast as my legs could carry me towards the Apollo table, a place where I would be safe from her. I started getting closer and closer to my safety table, but I suddenly felt two hands go around my waist, a cheek suddenly brushed against mine and Emma said, "Oh, you are so cute when you run away." Emma, let me go! I cried out, trying to get out of her grip, which seemed uncharacteristically strong for an Aphrodite kid. No, you always eat with the Apollo kids, now you should try and eat with us Aphrodite kids. I assure we have the best food in the entire camp. Emma declared in a righteous voice as she continued pinching my cheeks. The food is the same for everyone, Emma, now let me go, please. I started pleading since it seemed as if I couldn't escape her grip. I felt her head move and she seemed to be staring directly into my white eyes, which I couldn't really tell. Fine, she said with an exasperated sigh. I sighed with relief and hurriedly ran towards the Apollo table just in case anything else were to happen or attack me beforehand. I finally made it towards the Apollo table and sat beside Clark and another kid of shadowy mass who I couldn't recognize based on just his shadowy form. "Sup, Clark?" I said. He didn't even look at me as he asked in a monotone voice while munching on a toast got caught by Emma. "Yeah. I know I am just 5 and she is 13, but she is way too fast," I replied. We continued eating our breakfast while making some light small talk, and just as the breakfast was about to end, a horn was heard all around camp. BWWOOORRR. As we all turned to the origin of the noise, two shadowy figures stood there. One was my dad and the other was the person who had blown the horn, who could be no one else but Argus. "Ahem," my dad said as he cleared his throat. "Today, since it will be the hunters' first day staying here, both Artemis and I have decided to do the usual activity, capture the flag." As soon as my dad finished speaking, the campers struck into a resounding cheer, probably since we had won the last capture the flag against the hunters. At least that is what I heard, since we won it when I wasn't even born. All right, settle down kids, we all know the rules of the game. Each side will form a team of 13 people which you can choose amongst yourselves. Since the last game was won by the hunters, the campers will get to decide what side of the woods to place their flag. My dad said, finishing explaining somewhat the rules of the game. Come on Ozzy. We need to get chosen, Clark suddenly said as he slapped my back with so much force I stumbled forward. Sir, yes sir. I replied in a super serious manner while raising my hand to my forehead. Come on you buffoon. He finished saying. The campers started gathering around the Hermes cabin since it was mostly where us campers would gather while the hunters seemed to direct themselves towards the Artemis cabin. After an hour of proper discussion and a whole lot of help from Clark, Kevin, and the Aphrodite kids, I was chosen as one of the 13 campers to face against them. Concretely, I was chosen to be one of the 2 guards. We then made it back to the dining tables, where my dad was still waiting for everyone, and after half an hour more the hunters finally arrived. Okay, those who will fight for the campers' side step forward. My dad yelled, Clark, Kevin, me and 10 other campers stepping forward. Now those on the hunters' side. He continued with 13 hunters stepping forward, the 2 most noticeable ones for me being a super tall shadowy mass and another one who, while not as imposing in figure as the previous, had a slight red shade in her color, something I had only seen in the practice monsters around camp. What side have you chosen? My dad said as he started questioning our side. We have chosen the Eastwood side. Chloe, a 16-year-old daughter from the Demeter cabin and our chosen spokesman. Very well. My dad said, then come pick your flags and start heading toward the forest. You will have half an hour to place the flag in your chosen spot, and remember it has to be clearly visible. When my dad finished speaking, both Chloe and the hunter who had the slight red aura around her both came up to Chiron and grabbed the tall flags at his sides. After that Chloe came towards us and we started making our way to the forest. The battle for bragging rights had finally begun. Chapter 9, Capture the Flag, 1. Camp Half-Blood, August 7, 1996. Okay, let's go over the plan, Chloe said as she directed herself to everyone after we had planted our flag in a spot. Hugh and Athena Kid and our main strategist started speaking. The hunters are known to be a group that has fought as a cohesive and singular unit since its conception, so they probably won't stray too far from that logic and move as a single group while leaving 2 defenders for their flag. So we will divide ourselves into 3 groups aside from the 2 defenders, Chloe and Odysseus, who will stay here and guard the flag. Both Chloe and I nodded at his words. The first group will be a group of 5 and the main fighting force. They will head straight through the forest and try to enter a direct confrontation with the hunters. This group will consist of Harlan, Kevin, Sebastian, Cecilia, and me. The second and third groups will be groups of 3 that will outflank the hunters' main fighting force and attack the flag. So this means they will need to be a fast strike force. The second's group members will be Clark, Ava, and Finn. The third's group members will be Miles, Anna and Margot. Hugh said, finally finishing the strategy we had decided on. Just as Hugh finished speaking, a low-frequency sound started resounding all around the forest, the war horn, meaning the game had finally begun. BWWOORRR. The others quickly divided into groups and started running across their designated destinations, both strike force taking the south and northwest respectively while the main groups ran straight west. Okay kid, we need to start preparing ourselves. Hugh's plan is solid, but the hunters could easily encounter a scout group or break through the main group, so we need to be ready. Chloe said with a determined voice. Understood, madam. I replied almost instinctively. Call me Chloe, madam sounds weird, ha ha ha. She suddenly laughed out boisterously, a trait that normally wasn't seen among Demeter kids, since they were pretty shy all things considered. She continued speaking. I know from Clark that you are both an archer and a spearman, but you will mainly be providing support for me from the trees with your arrows. What if you are pressured or I see a good enough opening? Should I close the distance between a hunter and I and fight her with my spear then? I questioned while touching my trusty spear strapped to my back. Well, I would say no, since while you do have good mastery over your weapons, if what everyone told me about you was true, you are still a kid, so because of weight alone you are already at a disadvantage. But if you see that we are about to lose, then I give you permission to attack with your spear if you deem it right. Chloe answered back. Thanks Chloe, I replied while smiling as hard as I could, and I noticed Chloe's green aura intensify for a moment and heard a low murmur, so cute. After our small conversation I grabbed my bow also strapped to my back and did as Chloe said. I climbed a tree so as to have a better ambush point if any hunters were to get through. Now we just had to wait and stay alert. Kevin POV. Seriously, I still don't get why we let Ozzy in. I mean, he is pretty good and all, but he isn't even 6 yet. Cecilia, another Aries kid, suddenly said. He got in, because of votes and because of his ability. I replied in a calm manner, though some spite at her saying anything about Ozzy not deserving to be in when he trained harder than any camper I knew. Okay, calm down, lover boy, I was just saying he is still pretty young. Cecilia replied back. Stop discussing this, we need to stay focused on what we are doing now. Hugh said, cutting off our argument. Suddenly I heard a whirling sound, and before I even knew what I was doing, my demigod-given ADHD did its work and I raised my shield. Clang! An arrow fell to the ground before me, then I heard a voice. Sebastian and Athena Kid suddenly yelled, "Ambush!" A volley of arrows came from out front, their whirling sound an indicator of their closeness. We all raised our shield and with a deafening clang we blocked their arrows. "Go forward!" Hugh yelled with a commanding tone. My body reacted on its own as if it was made to be led and ordered into war. I dashed towards the spot where the original arrow had come from, my allies an inch behind me. Another volley rained on us, but we didn't stop running at the hunters and just raised our shields to deflect them. I finally saw one, hiding in the foliage. As soon as our eyes made eye contact, we heard a girly voice yell, "Hunters now!" With that, all the 11 hunters came out from their hiding spots in the foliage in front of us and started heading towards us as they unsheathed their weapons, daggers, blades. As I thought about the head-on fight and closing distance between, I unsheathed my sword, its celestial bronze shining brightly, the adrenaline in my veins pumping as fast as it could. I couldn't help but think, oh, this is going to be fun. Author note: short chapter. I know, I promise the next one will be super long. Either way, I am gonna put all the kids' names and which godly parent they belong to, just in case I don't say it in the actual story. Also sorry for all the characters, but hey, it's camp. Odysseus, son of Chiron, Kevin, Cecilia and Harlan, children of Ares, Hugh and Sebastian, children of Athena, Clark, Ava, Anna and Margot, children of Apollo, Finn and Miles, children of Hermes, Chloe, daughter of Demeter. Creator's thoughts. Hoped you like this chapter. Also drop some power stones, it ups the endorphins in my body, lol. Chapter 10, Capture the Flag, 2. Camp Half-Blood, August 7, 1996. Kevin POV. Clong. With a metallic sound I sent one of the hunters backwards, but soon 2 more started attacking me. I raised my shield and blocked a strike from a dagger that came from the left and blocked a blade coming from the right with my sword, the clashing celestial bronze producing small sparks from the friction. As the battle raged on, I continued parrying, blocking, and trying to counterattack whenever I could, but the continued pressure made by the hunters was pushing all of us to our limits. The hunter with the sword came rushing at me again. I then parried her blade and redirected it to the ground. Before she could pull it out of the ground, I bashed my shield against her face, loosening her grip from the blade and sending her flying backwards unconscious. 1 down, a few more to go, I thought, but just as I caught my breath, a hunter with a bronze dagger launched herself at me, and before I could react she cut my arm, the searing pain causing me to drop my shield. I prepared myself to fight once again, but I then heard a slump to the ground, where Hugh lay unconscious, bleeding from his legs. The battle's pace quickened. Little by little we whittled down some hunters, but they did the same, until finally only Cecilia and I were left facing 5 hunters. "Come on, lover boy, don't bail on me now," Cecilia said with a devilish grin on her face. "Shut up, Cecilia, just fight," I replied while keeping my eyes on the remaining hunters. The odds were against us. We didn't need to beat all the hunters, we just needed to stall them long enough. The hunters circled us, their weapons glinting dangerously in the dim light. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, heightening my senses. Cecilia lunged at one of the hunters with incredible speed, her movements fluid and precise. I followed suit, engaging another hunter who seemed to be sizing me up. The hunters continued ganging up on us when suddenly I felt a sudden hit on my head and I fell to the ground. The last thing I could see before I fell unconscious was the pommel of the dagger that hit me, and Cecilia still fighting against the remaining 5. MC POV. This is boring, BB boring, I sang while stringing my bowstring on top of a tree. Concentrate, Odysseus, Chloe whispered from her own hiding spot in the foliage under the tree where I was hiding. Thump. A tremor traveled through my entire body. Thump. A tremor rippled through my body once more, a dull ache settling in my chest. The pain migrated, from my chest to my eyes, compelling me to squeeze them shut. In that darkness, my peculiar sight stirred awake. At first, my sight had been confined to the narrow aperture where my eyes pointed. But now, it unfurled, stretching beyond mere sight lines. I could perceive the world in a full 360 degrees. The distance, too, expanded, as if my vision were a lens zooming out, capturing the vastness of the forest. Yet, my sight didn't stop there. It evolved further, reshaping my perception. I started discerning details from the shadowy masses that I could see before the rugged texture of tree bark, the outlines of Chloe's eyes, mouth, and nose. But the colors I could see remained the same, the world clinging to distinct shades of black and the colorful auras that clung to certain beings. With my newly developed sight I was able to see a group of women running at us. It was a group of 5 and I recognized 2 of them. One was the woman with slightly red aura, the commander of the hunters, while the other was the bulky woman I had seen at camp. I quickly whispered in Chloe's direction, "Hey, Chloe, they are coming, it is a group of 5. Chloe looked at me with a questioning look, something I was finally able to see after my sight had evolved. "Okay, Odysseus, remember the plan," she said with a determined face. As they drew nearer, I swiftly retrieved an arrow from my quiver, knocked it onto my bow, and began drawing it to full anchor position. I steadied my breath to ensure precision. Gradually exhaling, I released the arrow. Whoosh! The arrow surprised the hunters, finding its mark and penetrating the gut of one, causing her to kneel in pain. The woman with the red aura started barking orders, prompting the hunters to disperse. I readied another arrow, aiming for the bulky woman, drew it to full anchor, and released it. However, she anticipated the attack, dodging the arrow skillfully. It pierced a tree behind her. Drawing another arrow, I focused on the hulking hunter. Meanwhile, Chloe executed her part of the plan, whispering ancient Greek incantations that summoned vines and branches from the surrounding trees to attack some of the hunters. Amazed by the capabilities of a child of Demeter, I noted the drawback: Chloe needed to remain stationary to maintain concentration. My role was clear: to protect her from any approaching threats while she controlled the forest's branches and vines. My attention returned towards the more imposing threat as I let my arrow fly towards the hulking hunter. Chloe continued her onslaught on the other hunters. The sequence of events repeated, with Chloe handling most of the attackers, and I focused on individual threats to keep them away from her. Finally, I managed to immobilize the hunter I had targeted, hitting her legs with arrows. However, my focus on this hunter allowed the red aura hunter to get dangerously close to Chloe. Unable to get a clear shot with my bow, I decided to abandon it, unstrapped my quiver, and let both the quiver and bow fall from my hiding spot. Drawing my spear from my back, I leaped to the ground with a thump and sprinted towards the red aura hunter. Intercepting her, she warned, "Get out of my way, demigod." "At least introduce yourself first," I replied in a joking manner while preparing for the impending battle. "A man doesn't need to know my name," the hunter replied, unsheathing 2 daggers that were strapped to her sides. The hunter dashed at me with impressive speed, faster than most demigods. Planting my feet firmly, I extended my spear and lunged, but she skillfully blocked it with her daggers, redirecting the attack. Utilizing the momentum, I spun, aiming for her, but she swiftly ducked under the spear, piercing my gut with one of her daggers. As she withdrew the blades, leaving me bleeding on the ground, a low-frequency sound echoed the war horn. BWWOORRR. It seemed that one of our strike teams had been able to capture the flag. Instantly, upon hearing the horn, I succumbed to unconsciousness, collapsing to the ground. Creator's thoughts. Hope you like this chapter. Also don't worry about stuff like injuries. Aside from having better regeneration because of being a demigod, THA camp has a ton of ambrosia and nectar to fix them up. That is why the one rule was no killing or maiming, since those are 2 things that ambrosia and nectar can't fix. Chapter 11, A Weird Dream, and since when could crows talk? My gut, seriously, who would stab a 5-year-old, ducking crazy bitch? I said aloud as I sat up. I looked around and realized I wasn't in the big house. Place uncown, time uncown. All around me complete and absolute darkness, which looked as if not even the smallest bit of light could penetrate. Suddenly the darkness started moving all around me. Rumble. The rumbling stopped and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Tens, no hundreds of eyes all around me, their pupils moving in unison, all looking at me. "Welcome, son, it is nice to finally see you, but you shouldn't be here." A voice spoke out, encompassing the entire space with its divine tone. "Hey, wait son, what do you mean?" I questioned. Instead of an answer, the voice remained quiet and I suddenly sunk into the ground. Big House Medical Wing, 8th of August 1996. My eyes sprung open, once more, as I realized I was in one of the big house beds, probably at the medical wing if the bandages around my gut and torso were anything to go by. With my new sight I didn't even need to get off the bed, thank God, to see what was around me. There seemed to be 3 other people in here, with one of them being the hunter I had pierced straight through the gut. I tried going back to sleep since the bed was way too comfy not to try, when a female voice spoke out to me, "You're going back to sleep again even though you just slept for almost 24 hours, damn kid, you are slothful as heck." I recognized the voice almost immediately, but before replying I made a mental note that even with my newly evolved sight I still couldn't see her. "Yes Artemis, I am going back to sleep, just don't tell my dad." I said back to her. Okay, whatever you say, and here I thought we could go for a little hunt of our own. Artemis said with some cheekiness evident in her voice. At her words I reluctantly got out of the bed, since the prospect of being taught even the slightest bit of hunting by the goddess of the hunt was an enticing enough offer. We both made our way out of the big house, my injury proving to be almost completely cured if the absence of pain was any indicator. With a flick of her hand, Artemis seemed to spawn a bow and a quiver full of arrows, which she handed over to me. So where are we going to hunt? I asked enthusiastically. Wait a moment, kid, another person is coming with us. Artemis replied. At her words I focused on my sight and checked on everyone around camp. Where my sight reached, I noticed the hunter with a slight tint of red aura heading in our direction. Oh please, not her! I said aloud. Yep, Zoe is coming with us, Odysseus, after all she is my commander. Artemis said as she probably heard me. The hunter, who I now knew her name was Zoe, approached us, and I could see how her smile at seeing Artemis turned into a frown as she looked at me, so I just waved at her from Artemis' side, trying to get on her nerves, which seemed to work as her frown turned into a full-on scowl at my gesture. Lady Artemis, why must this man-child come with us? Zoe questioned Artemis, her scowl never leaving her face. He is Chiron's son, and therefore he is something like my grandchild. I can't exactly let my grandchild be bad at hunting now, can I? Artemis said, trying to appease her subordinate. Understood, Lady Artemis. Zoe replied. I couldn't help but think, thanks Dad, you are the best, after hearing Artemis' reasoning for letting me accompany them in a hunt. We started traveling towards the north woods, a place infested with monsters and where Artemis said we would find our prey. We rushed towards the woods, trying to find our prey. As we reached it, I suddenly heard different voices. It's the son of darkness. He seems a little small, right? He can bring us corn. I turned towards where I kept on hearing the voices, where 3 crows were settled on a branch. He is looking at us, one of the crows said as he hit the other 2 with his wings. Hurry, look imposing. Another one said as they all puffed their chests. I couldn't help but be weirded out and stop running. Kid, why are you stopping? Come on. Artemis said. Hey, yeah right. I replied as we went back to running deeper into the woods, while keeping my sight located on the 3 crows for as long as I could, since they seemed to be following me around. Author note, sorry for the short chapter, it is just I didn't really have a lot to say in this chapter and I didn't want to drag it on. Also, ladies and gents, Artemis does like Odysseus in a family kind of way. In Greek mythos, Artemis is also known for being caring towards children, so that is another reason as to why she isn't bothered about Odysseus being a male, although that may change when he grows up. Chapter 12, A Goats, a Nymph, and a Kid. As we moved deeper and deeper into the woods, my sight seemed to pick on something, a huge serpent-like creature with an intense red aura surrounding its form, almost 12 meters long with 4 legs, 2 horns on its head and a tongue that split in 4 different directions. A drien, I thought. Artemis seemed to catch on to the monster's presence as well, since she said aloud, over here. Changing her direction, which I could only tell because of Zoe's presence and how she was moving, we seemed to be getting closer to the drien. Within moments, the unmistakable sounds of bowstrings being drawn reached my ears, and I mirrored the action. The drien, sensing our approach, began to sniff the air, likely picking up on the scent of Zoe and me. Suddenly, it unleashed a deafening roar that reverberated through the trees, shaking both the foliage and the very ground beneath our feet. Ruoar. Split up and target its eyes, its scales will be too hard to penetrate for our arrows. Artemis said in an enthusiastic manner. She really was the goddess of the hunt, I couldn't help but think. We all split up in different directions, but the drien seemed to be fully focused on me as he kept on sniffing the air and following in my direction. I drew an arrow onto my bow and let it fly. A distinct clinging sound could be heard as I had missed its eyes and hit its scales on top of its head. As the drien kept on approaching me, a flurry of arrows flew at it from 2 different directions, gaining its attention. Infuriated, it turned towards one of the places where the arrows kept on coming from and started rushing at it. Just as he started picking up speed, another arrow flew at it and pierced its eye, ichor starting to pour onto its face as it let out a screeching roar of pain and anger. Roa. As it finished roaring, smoke started pouring out of its mouth, and one of the 3 crows, which I hadn't noticed had been following me since I had been a little preoccupied, said in an anxious voice, Master, get away. The drien's smoke is poisonous. I looked at the crow for a moment and did as I was told, running away from the smoke while still trying to keep myself at a good enough distance so my sight could catch both Zoe and the drien. I drew another arrow and placed it on my bow, letting it fly towards the drien once again, and again the distinct clinging sound could be heard. But it seemed as if it had annoyed him a lot, since I could see it turn its head and look directly at me. Even with Zoe and Artemis firing 10 times more arrows than me, I didn't know what the hell I did to get this monster's anger. Suddenly, faster than I could perceive with my sight, the monster disappeared from its position, appearing once again behind me, the crow from before yelling from one of the treetops, "Master, behind you!" I didn't even need to turn, my sight had finally caught up and the draken's gaping mouth was just seconds away from swallowing me whole. I couldn't help but say aloud, "Hey, I am gonna die." But suddenly from my shadow 3 shadowy black squid-like tentacles formed and flew straight through the monster's gaping mouth and stabbing its brain, staining me with a waterfall of the monster's ichor. My jaw dropped at seeing the sequence of events that had unfolded before my very eyes. Before so could even close my jaw again, the 3 black tentacles submerged themselves back into my shadow. "Looks like you killed it," the voice of my adoptive grandmother broke my stupefied train of thought. "Yet I guess I did," I replied, still somewhat amazed over what had just happened. "How did you do it?" she questioned as I heard how she inspected the draken's corpse. "I don't know, it was behind me and suddenly 3 black things came from below me and killed it, honest," I said fervently while putting my right hand to my heart. "I believe you, don't worry, kid," Artemis replied back. Zoe then came over to where we were and asked Artemis, "Did he kill it?" "Yes, he did," Artemis replied. "Hey, then I guess he isn't as useless as most other men," Zoe continued as the aura around her body changed, the red dissipating completely and the orange around her dwindled to a considerable degree. "Well, let's go back to camp," Artemis said with a happy voice. "After all, we can't let your dad know what you were doing, now can we, Odysseus?" "Oh, yeah, you are right, let's go back," I said, somewhat anxious if Dad were ever to learn what I had done just after waking up from my injury. Artemis POV. After arriving back at camp, we first left my lieutenant, Zoe Nightshade, at my own divine cabin, something I still found somewhat stupid to have, but hey, it was a good place for my hunters to rest. Then Odysseus and I started going towards the big house, and silently Odysseus went back to his room, probably scared to be caught by little ol Chiron, something I couldn't help but laugh internally about as I saw how similar they both were. I then started walking around the big house once again, but I wasn't going back to my room. I reached the room I wanted to and walked inside. The room was filled with hundreds of books lined up carefully as if they were in a small little library, and in the middle of it all was a centaur with slick black brown hair with some grey starting to show something which was weird, giving the being's immortal nature. "Chiron," I said aloud, grabbing his attention. He slowly closed his book and placed it on a small glass table. "The only thing in here aside from the books themselves, yes, Artemis," he replied back with his signature calm voice with which he had won over so many Olympians and Greek heroes. "I have come here to talk about Odysseus," I continued. "If this is about the little hunt you took him on, don't worry, Argus already told me you took him," he said before I could even finish saying what I wanted to say. "No, it isn't that, you little runt." "Well, it kind of is. Do you know who the boy's godly parents is?" I questioned, a small vein appearing on my forehead. "No, I mean he has shown proficiency is different things, but never so much in one as for me to jump to a conclusion, and besides I am his parent, so what does it matter, who his godly parent is?" Chiron said with a slight amount of anger coming out of his voice. "It isn't that I think you are a bad parent, Chiron, but in our little hunt, as you call it, he killed the prey with shadows," I said seriously. "You know as well as I do that only one Olympian has enough control over shadows to pass it on to their children." "Hades," Chiron said while finishing my train of thought. "Exactly, if either Poseidon or my father find out," I said while trailing off. "Are you sure?" he questioned me one last time. "As sure as I am still a virgin," I replied. "Leave me alone, Artemis, please, I need to think," Chiron said. I did as he said and left his room, but as I left I couldn't help but see Chiron's contemplative and emotional look. Author note: both you and I know that Odysseus isn't a son of Hades, lol, but being a child of Primordial is something that has never happened, so this is the normal conclusion people like Artemis and Chiron would reach. Creator's thoughts. Hope you liked this chapter. I will try to upload another one today since I couldn't upload one yesterday. Chapter 13, I am a Disney princess. 2 years later. Climbing wall, 22nd of August 1998. A ragged breath escaped my mouth as I jump onto the next hold of the wall. I couldn't help but look up at the quickly tipping lava about to pour onto me from the adjacent wall. I concentrated and kept on climbing from hold to hold just like I had practiced many times before, and with a final grab I made it to the top and pulled myself up as the two walls finally clashed and the lava started pouring. The heat it was radiating beginning to make me uncomfortable. "That, huff, was, huff, close," I said aloud in ragged breaths. "That was amazing, master," 3 squeaky voices said above me. "Thanks guys," I replied to their excited and passionate cheering. After regaining a bit of my strength from the climb, I grabbed the rope on the outside of the wall and climbed it down, my 3 crows who had never left me since the incident with the drien following closely behind me. Master, your next activity is arts and crafts. One of my crows specifically, Corvus, I know basic ass name, said. I know Corvus, you don't have to remind me each of my lessons. I replied. But master, what if you forgot? Another crow, Skia, said in a serious-like manner. Guys, I have been doing this since I was born. I don't think I can forget what class I have next even if I wanted to, I said while laughing at their antics. With a small skip in my step at finally being able to complete the final level of the climbing wall, I reached the whereabouts of my next lesson, a plain field with different sections made for different artistic events. One was filled with marble for sculpting, another with paints and canvases. While some campers thought that this was a stupid class or that it wasn't essential, this isn't really true, as many gods do in fact value a painting or sculpture made for them, making them have their protection on their quests. I walked to the canvases where a lot of Athena kids normally were and grabbed a brush, and since I couldn't see color, I started drawing something that had been bugging me since over 2 years ago. As I started drawing the figure I had dreamt of those years ago, animals starting coming over towards me, including animals like mice, snakes, lizards, and crows. The more the figure came to life, the more the animals approached me. This was something which occurred often when I was painting this figure, which had earned me the nickname of Snow White, since I had pale white skin, black hair, and I could talk to animals. With the finished painting, I finally let my brush down. Amazing, all the animals yelled in a cacophony of voices as they witnessed the finished painting. Master! That has to be your best one yet, Corvus said in an excited tone as he flew around me. Yet too bad my sight doesn't let me see it too well, I replied with a regretful tone in my voice. Sure, it was awesome being able to see in a 360-degree vision, but at the end of the day I was still blind. I didn't let my thoughts linger on that too long and said, well, either way, let's go to the next class. Let's, my 3 crows replied in unison, and at the same time all other animals seemed to vanish out of their stupor and they all took off in different directions. I started moving towards the archery range, which sadly was at almost the other end of the camp, so I had to run towards class. While running towards class, my dad started galloping towards me, so I stopped to let him catch up, which he was going to do anyway. After he finally caught up, my dad said, Odysseus, come with me, you have a special class you need to start. Okay dad, I replied while following his lead, since after all he was Chiron, the teacher of almost all Greek heroes. We started going towards the Zeus pile, a place silently referred to by the campers as the pile of deer poop. When we finally reached it, my dad, which had kept quiet almost the entire way, said in a calm manner, from today on we will meet here at this time to start your newest class, manipulating the mist. When it comes to manipulating the mist, it depends on a variety of things, but the 2 main ones are your affinity towards the most, which is normally dictated by how powerful a demigod is and how much you change the perception of the person with the mist. It is much simpler making yourself appear as someone else through the mist than disappear completely. Wait, but aren't monsters themselves obscured by the mist from mortals? I asked. Yes, that is something the mist does on its own, as if it had its own little conscience which we can influence slightly. My dad replied. Even if you were truly blind to manipulate the mist, you don't need your eyes but intent and will, intent to have a clear vision of what you want the mortals to see, and will to impose that vision onto the mortals themselves. My dad continued. So how exactly should I practice this? I mean, it isn't like we can grab a mortal and somehow have him cross the barriers so that we can experiment how to manipulate the mist. I asked my father, once again, eagerness coming out of my voice at the chance of learning a new ability. Well, that is why we are here, son. While you will usually impose the mist on mortals, you can also do so on monsters, which is why we are here, since weak monsters like the golden ants usually gather around here. My dad said, a small smile forming on his lips. He then picked up a flute I don't know from where and started playing it, a serene tune starting to come out from it. I then asked, hey dad, where the hell did you get that flute? Suddenly my sight caught onto more than 24 giant ants running at our direction, and the smile on my dad's face grew even bigger as he continued playing his tune. Creator's thoughts. Let's go. I uploaded the 2nd chapter today, hope you all enjoyed it. Chapter 14, Nah, I'd missed. Zeus Pile, 22nd of August 1998. Dad, I think you should stop playing now, I said with a slight amount of nervousness in my voice at the quickly approaching masses of giant ants. The skidding sounds of their feet, and my father's tune creating an eerie symphony of noise all around me. As my father heard my words, he finally stopped playing and said in a calm manner, Odysseus, if you wanna survive, you better start trying to control the mist instead of looking at me like that. I looked at my father, my mouth somewhat agape at his words. Okay, let's do this, I said in a resolute voice while slapping my cheeks with my hands to concentrate. I closed my eyelids, which honestly didn't change anything, but it did help me concentrate subconsciously. I didn't think about how many ants there were or how quickly they were approaching, rather I tried to feel out the mist. I reached out to it with my own intent, the mist quickly amassing itself over me as I enforced my will onto it, something that came naturally easy to do. After I had enough of a hold over the mist, I then started implanting first a vision of what I wanted the ants to see, which was absolutely nothing. I wanted to become invisible to them by camouflaging myself to the environment from their point of view. Then as soon as I had a clear enough vision of what I wanted to implant onto the ants, I started placing the mist from which I had a hold on around the quickly approaching horde of ants. As I kept on concentrating on putting my will of the mist on each individual ant, my father quickly made a sword appear in his hand and cut down the middle one of the ants that had gotten too close to our location. The rest seemed to pass right over us, as I had placed a strong enough intent on all of them, so they couldn't see me and they couldn't see my dad, since he probably manipulated the mist in the same manner. Good job for your first try. But you took too much time when gathering the mist and placing your intent on it. On the other hand, you placed your will on the golden ants at an exceptionally fast rate for your first try. My dad said, a small smile forming on his shadow-like face. Well then I guess we should try again. My dad said, his smile getting wider once again and a flute again magically appearing in his hand. After his tune began playing once again, more ants started approaching our location once again. I then implanted my will on the mist and then the mist on the ants themselves. This cycle continued for the rest of the day. Slowly I grew better, taking less time to implant my will and making my visions more powerful. Chiron POV. As the sun dipped down below the horizon, I couldn't help but feel proud at seeing my son improving each time he manipulated the mist. His sweating face and ragged breath a sign of all his effort. Odysseus, that is enough for today, I said in a soothing voice as I put my hand on his head. Hey, no dad, I can still go on, he replied, but even the worst Aries kid would be able to see that he needed to rest. No, come on, it is time to eat dinner with the rest of the campers, I said once again in a soothing manner, something which came naturally to me. Okay dad, he replied in a tired voice, but as soon as he took his first step he closed his eyelids and fell asleep. Just before he fell, I caught him with my arms and started carrying him back to the big house. As I walked back, I couldn't help but contemplate on Odysseus and my relationship. While some campers thought that I treated Odysseus too harshly, which was somewhat true, or that I gave him preferential treatment, which was also somewhat true, I truly thought that I was doing what was best for him, especially given his last 2 years and the abilities that he seemed to have developed. MCPOV. I woke up once again in my bed at the big house. I guess I passed out yesterday, I said aloud. I then prepared myself for the next classes and left for breakfast at the Hestia hearth with the rest of the campers. As I left the house, a grumpy raspy voice said, looks like you were sleepy yesterday, hey, Oliver Seuss. Oh, shut up Mr. D, I replied back quickly, almost subconsciously, as I descended the deck stairs, quickly leaving for my first class. As I approached the location for my first class today, the combat arena, I couldn't help but think about if I should use the mist on my opponents today or if that would be cheating. Before I could finish my decision whether to handicap myself, my 3 loyal crows flew at me once again and yelled in enthusiastic voices, good morning master, ready for your first lesson? Yes, I am, I replied back, a small smile forming on my face as each crow perched themselves on their designated spots, Corvus on my right shoulder, Skia on my left shoulder, and Randy, I know weird name for a crow to have, perched on my head. I entered the combat arena, an amphitheater-like structure where campers trained their fighting skills. Loads of racks with weapons were located at the arena's side and straw fighting dolls wearing Greek armor littered it as well. Hey, looks like little Snowhite finally arrived. A voice I recognized too well, not because I knew her or anything, but rather because she was a friend of Kevin's, Cecilia, an Aries kid. Instead of answering her provocation, I just looked at her with the kindest smile I could and said, wanna spar? Hey, no thanks dude, she said as she quickly left me alone once again. After the little talk with Cecilia, I went to one of the weapon racks and picked up a spear. Then as more campers started coming into the arena, I grabbed my 2 somewhat usual partners for this class, Hugh, a kid from Athena, and obviously Kevin. We 3 came together and gathered at one of the amphitheater less populated places. Kevin unsheathed his sword and raised his shield, Hugh raised his spear and raised mine as well. Good luck master. My 3 crows squawked from their positions as they started flying above me so I could actually fight. So same rules as always? Hugh asked. Yeah, 2v1 against me, same as always, I said with a small smirk. Chapter 15, A Spar and a Quest. Combat Arena, 23rd of August 1998. 3,2,1 Start. I yelled at the top of my lungs as both Hugh and Kevin rushed at me, a huge smile appearing on my face. Hugh lunged at me first, his spear aimed directly at my heart. I quickly sidestepped and performed a lunge myself, aiming at his shoulder, but Kevin quickly saw Hugh's trouble and blocked my spear with his shield, a distinct clinging noise resounding from it. Before I could recover from my lunge, Kevin swung his sword at me, which I couldn't find a way to stop, so I just smiled a bit, and from my shadow almost instantaneously a shadow tendril formed beneath me and caught the blade's edge before it could get any closer to my unprotected body. Damn, I had to use them even sooner this time. I sighed aloud as two other tendrils appeared from beneath me and hit Hugh on his chest as he tried to defend with his spear, and Kevin as well as he protected himself with his shield. They were both sent flying backwards. When they landed onto the arena's floor, a small amount of sand rising and enveloping their fallen forms. But they were half-bloods. I knew that wasn't going to stop them, and through my sight I saw how both of slowly got back up, Kevin's shield falling to the ground splintered and battered while Hugh's spear had been shattered in two. You need a new spear, Hugh," Kevin said while gritting his teeth. "Yeah dude, if you could summon one that would be great," Hugh replied. Kevin stretched out his hand, and one of the spears that were on the weapon of the racks before suddenly appeared in his hand as if by magic. Wait, no, it actually was magic. He then threw it at Hugh, and Hugh caught it with his right hand. "So you guys ready once again?" I asked with a mischievous tone. "Yeah, Ozzy. We are ready," Kevin replied once again. They both rushed at me once again, but this time, since I had already manifested my shadow tendrils, I wasn't going to go easy on them. I pointed my spear at both of their rushing figures, and two of my shadow tendrils charged at them as well. With a skillful display of thief weapons in their own bodies, they dodged the tendrils' first attack and quickly cut them down at whatever part they could. As I stood there concentrating on somewhat manipulating my tendrils, I couldn't help but hear my crows cheering voices. "Yeah, that's our master." With my crows cheering, I felt as if I couldn't disappoint them, so I sent my last shadow tendril to deal with Hugh and I went after Kevin. While he was distracted, I quickly performed a lunge at one of his legs since I didn't want to maim him, but it seemed he had caught onto my plan as he was able to swiftly block my attack just before raising his sword once again to deal with the tendril. But of course that couldn't last long at my tendrils, and I combined pressure. It was only a short time before Kevin buckled under it. With a swift strike I pierced my spear through his shoulder and pinned him to the ground. "Hey, seems I won," I said with a small smile on my face. "No, you haven't, Ozzy. Hugh is still conscious," Kevin replied, and just as the final word came out of his mouth, a resounding thump was heard. We both turned to look at where the noise came from. Not like I really had to, and there dangling in the air by his ankles thanks to my shadow tendrils was Hugh. "Well, I guess now it is over," I said once again as my crows flew back down and perched themselves down on my body. "I guess it is," Kevin said. "Come on, let's get you to the infirmary," I said with a slight concern in my voice as I pulled him up from the floor without taking my spear from his shoulder, since that would be a stupid thing to do. "Yeah, let's," Kevin said as a slight grunt of pain left his voice. Kevin POV. As both Ozzy, me and Hugh's unconscious body walked to the big house so we could get healed up with a good dose of nectar and Apollo Kid healing. I involuntarily zoned out into the dream I had this night. And if it was what I thought it was, the infirmary wasn't the only reason I needed to go to the big house for, but I didn't decide to think about that right now, and I turned to look at Ozzy talking with his crows, which still was the weirdest thing about him, all things considered, since there wasn't a record of a demigod who could speak only to crows. Ozzy was an anomaly for sure. He showed up here as a baby. Hell, some campers including Ozzy himself had the marble on their camp necklace to prove it, since it showed a picture of him as a baby, then was adopted by Chiron, and now he was awakening powers no demigod should have in this day and age. It seemed as if I had been staring at him for too long as Ozzy jokingly said, "Hey dude, I know I am beautiful, but no need to stare." At that I couldn't help but laugh, since he has told me how his sight worked and he didn't even know how anyone actually looked like. "Yeah, sorry dude, it is just that your beauty is too much," I replied to him. "Ha, I know that," he replied back. We then kept on complimenting each other somewhat homosexually, but hey, that is what the brothers are for. When we finally reached the infirmary, Odysseus then left both Hugh and me there since he needed to go to his next class. After an Apollo Kid bandaged me up and somewhat healed me, they gave some nectar to drink for the next few days on occasion to heal even faster. I left the infirmary but not the big house. There was still a place I needed to go, Chiron's office. After reaching it, I knocked on it twice and a somewhat elderly voice said in a soothing voice, "Come in." I entered his office, the creaking doors only adding to my anxiousness. "Hello, Chiron," I said somewhat nervously. "Oh, hello, Kevin, I was expecting you. Sit down," he said as he pointed at a chair in front of his desk, which I couldn't help but think as to why he would need a desk, probably to calm us down or something. "Well, your father has already told me everything. He should have somewhat told you as well, right?" Chiron inquired. Yes, sir. I replied. Okay, then we just need one final step to make sure and make it official. Follow me. He said, his voice lowering an octave. After that he stayed quiet and I followed him around the big house. Slowly we climbed the stories until we reached the Attica, place of dread and glory for demigods here at camp. Go in, she will be waiting for you of it destined. Chiron said. I inhaled a breath full of somewhat fresh air and opened the door. I saw it, the Oracle of Delphi, a somewhat shriveled old female mummy in a tie-down dress. Holy shit, I couldn't help but whisper. You'd think the Oracle would be a little I don't know oracly. I whispered once again as I closed the distance between the Oracle and me. As soon as I was less than a meter away, she opened his mouth with green smoke coming out of her mounts. As the green smoke concentrated itself in front of me, a clear vision could be seen. Ozzy at his archery range with his crows by his side as he kept on shooting arrows at the target at an amazing speed. Ha, cool, I couldn't help but think, but just as that last thought emerged, Ozzy's mouth opened wide and his voice somewhat distorted started speaking. In the land of the setting sun, a quest awaits. To the west he must travel to Gerion's gates. A son of Ares with shield and sword. A sacrifice of blood to please the god. The task is daunting but must be done. To ensure fate itself is not undone. Well, I guess it is official. Hey, I got a quest. I couldn't help but sigh. Creator's thoughts. I honestly really like this chapter, lol. Also, quests were pretty common at Camp Half-Blood before the last quest, that being Luke's in the original story. Chapter 16, I Can't Go. Camp Half-Blood, 24th of August 1998. No, you may not. My father's monotone voice permeated through the room, his words sounding like a declaration of death. What do you mean? Kevin is my best friend, and he has a quest. How come I can't go? I yelled at my father, a small amount of anger starting to bubble deep within me. I will say it again, Odysseus, you can't go. My father once again spoke with his soothing and somewhat monotone voice. But why? I couldn't help but question. I am one of the strongest demigods at camp, is it just because of my age? I questioned him while staring directly into the shadowy outlines of his eyes. Your age is one reason, but that isn't it. Again my father said, again with his monotone and soothing voice. Then tell me, the real reason. I yelled at him again, clenching my fists in anger. I can't. My father said, his voice for the first time faltering as he looked at me. We both looked at each other in silence for a few moments that seemed to stretch on forever. Fine. I replied with bitterness in my voice as I left his office and slammed the door behind me. Bam. After leaving my father's office, the anger inside me only kept rising, so I decided to go to the northern forest to let off some steam. Just as I left the big house, Mr. D said in his quippy voice, "Where are you heading off to, Oliver Seuss?" But I didn't reply and just beelined straight towards the woods. When I finally made it to the woods, my crows, Corvus, Skia, and Randy flew down from a treetop and started flying around me. They all asked jittery at the same time, "Master, where are you going?" I didn't want to take my anger out on them, so took a deep breath and said in a monotone voice, "Guys, can you please leave me alone for today?" They all looked at each other and said unanimously, "Very well, Master," and flew off once again. Being truly by myself in these woods, I started picking up speed and ran at one of the groups of giant ants which my sight had picked up. As I reached the ants' location, I summoned all of my 5 tendrils from my shadows and sent them directly at the ants. Feush, 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 feush. 5 distinct screeching sounds were heard as my tendrils pierced the giant bodies of 5 different ants. When I retracted my tendrils from their bodies, they hit the ground with a heavy slam as blood started to come out of the place which I pierced. Screech. The other ants, as soon as they noticed their companion's death, soon started running towards the spot where the tendrils had come from. That was me. As I saw the horde of 20-something shadowy ants with huge red auras surrounding them, I couldn't help but shout, "Come at me, you insects!" The tendrils moved, with power and motive. I used the tendrils to protect myself from the approaching horde, acting as a form of shield. The ants attacked me with an unstoppable fervor, but even in my mad state I didn't let it cloud my judgment, and I kept on dodging or blocking their clicking mandibles. One by one, I unraveled them. Tendrils coiled around their legs, squeezing. Their carapaces cracked, head were pierced, ichor spilling forth. Yet the horde pressed on. Their anger and my own coalescing into one. I reached deeper, tapping into the core of my being. I suddenly saw once again the being that I had seen once before in my dreams. Yet like the fleeting wind, the vision dissipated. Somehow my tendrils elongated, piercing the remaining ants' hearts. Their screeches harmonized, enveloping the entire forest in a symphony of agony. The ants collapsed, and they dissipated into the Tartarus. I stood amidst the silence forest, my breath ragged, tendrils retracting. That is somewhat better, I said with a blissful sigh as I looked upon the destruction my shadow tendrils had caused. I then left the forest, but my crows didn't seem to be waiting for me as I couldn't see them anywhere. It is. Well, if I can't go on the quest, I should at least say my goodbyes to Kevin and help him prepare. I sighed once again, remembering the conversation I had with him before about his sudden quest. I went to the spot where most quest takers should be the day after receiving their quest, their cabin. I slowly walked towards the 12 divine cabins and made my way to the Ares cabin. Its form was as menacing as walkways with barbed wire on the roof and the head of a boar hanging on the door. I opened the door directly since knocking here was kind of useless, and as soon as I opened the door I could see how all of the people inside turned to look at me. Hey, I know I look good, but this is more attention than I deserve, I said at the Ares kids. Oh, you little she, a kid on a top bunk bed said when he was quickly interrupted by a voice I could recognize. Hey, Ozzy, what are you doing here? Kevin asked as he walked towards me. Nothing much, just wanted to talk to you about your quest since you will be leaving soon, I said, flashing a smile. Oh, did you get your dad? Before he even finished asking his question I shook my head. Well, that is disappointing, but what are you gonna do? He continued as we left the Ares cabin together. So who are you gonna pick? I decided to ask him since he was the leader of the quest. Not sure, but I am probably gonna go with Hugh. After all, we have pretty good battle chemistry after fighting against you for so long, he quipped as he ruffled my hair. I took his hand off my head and started organizing my head once again, which was already pretty disorderly because of my battle. Don't do that, dude, you know I hate knowing how short I am, I said at him menacingly. Oh, come on, don't be like that, after all you are only 7 about to be 8. He replied back as he tried to put his hand on my head again. I dashed sideways and replied, yeah, but still not cool being reminded I am the shortest at camp. We continued talking as the day went on. We helped him prepare by first him picking a satyr for his quest, which honestly wasn't all that important, it was just a young satyr called Sebastian. After that we went to the Athena cabin and grabbed Hugh. We sparred a bit at the combat arena since it was the last time for a while we would be able to do it. Then as night started to come we started heading towards the edge of the camp where Argus was waiting to take them to Long Island so they could start their quest. Just as they both started getting in the car I said, good luck out there, guys. They both smiled at me, their blue auras flaring as they replied back, thanks, dude, you keep on training. After that they both got into the magical car and sped away. Dad, you can come out now, I said as I looked at the varnishing car. From behind a dense foliage a shadowy centaur with a huge blue aura stepped out. I know you think this is wrong of me, Odysseus, but it is for the best, with a somewhat sad tone as he looked at me. I honestly liked this chapter since you can see a lot of Odysseus' character, both from his obedience towards Chiron his father, the rage at not being able to help his best friend. Chapter 17, A New Camper. 2 months later. Uncount POV. Mr. Satyr, I couldn't help but ask, how much longer until we reach it? I questioned as me and my half-goat half-human companion made our way through a forest. Don't worry, it shouldn't be too long now, the satyr responded. I then went quiet once again, the only noise I could hear being those of our footsteps and the sounds of crickets. Suddenly the satyr who was in front of me disappeared into nothingness. Hey, I said aloud as I looked at his disappearing figure. The satyr then popped his head back, which looked somewhat creepy since it just seemed to be floating. Come on, it is safe to go through, the satyr said with a small smile on his face. I took a deep breath in and walked in after the satyr. Just as I took few steps forward I couldn't help but be shocked at the scene in front of me. A huge valley that seemed to dip from the surrounding mountains, a lake in the middle of the valley, fields of strawberries, a forest, and even a beach I could glimpse at the other side, and yet what caught my attention wasn't that but the differing structures that seemed to be built all around it. Thalia Grace, my accompanying satyr said, welcome to Camp Half-Blood. As the words left the half-goat's mouth a bubbling excitement which hadn't been there since the disappearance of my little brother started appearing. After we made our way to what seemed the entrance of the camp, which was just 2 giant marble pillars that seemed to simulate a door, with a marble tablet unifying the two by the top on which the words Camp Half-Blood could be read, waiting for me was a weird sight that I would probably get accustomed to as my time as a demigod. A huge centaur with hazel brown eyes, long dark brown hair that fell to his shoulders, and beside him, which gave the scene a somewhat comedic look, was a small boy probably no more than 8 years old with ruffled black hair that reached the back of his nape. A bow and quiver strapped to his back, but the two things that caught my attention was the tattoo on the child's hand that looked similar to a Greek helmet, and his eyes, which were completely white, pupils and all. I couldn't help but come to the realization that he was blind. "Hello, Thalia Grace, and welcome to our camp," the centaur said with a soothing voice that kind of weirded me out. "Serious, you may go." The centaur, he continued as he looked beside me at the satyr. The satyr, who I now knew his name was Sirius, nodded at him and quickly left as fast as he could towards the direction of the forest I had been able to see before. "Well, Thalia, as our newest camper, it is only natural for my son and I to receive you, but as I have other matters to attend to, I will leave you in my son's care. He will show you around camp and which cabin you will belong to until you are claimed." The centaur finally finished speaking to me as he gave me a small smile and trotted away. "Great, I have to deal with the newbies again," I heard the small boy whispering in a somewhat bitter voice. MCPOV. "Hey, I heard you, you know," the new shadowy girl with a slightly green aura said. "Well, I said it aloud," I replied back. "Either way, since my dad wants me to show you around, I guess that is what I have to do, again." I couldn't help but let out a sigh, since this was something which my dad made me do almost every time a new camper arrived at camp. "Wait dude, before we start this camp tour, what was that thing that the centaur dude said about me being claimed?" the girl asked me. I have to explain this again. I couldn't help but think, first of all, don't call him centaur dude, he is my dad, also known as Chiron, mentor of Greek heroes. Secondly, claiming is how we know what godly parent you belong to," I said, but before I could finish my explanation, her somewhat excited voice interrupted me, saying, "Wait, but I already know who my dad is." "Hey, you do?" I couldn't help but question while raising my eyebrows. "Yeah, it's Zeus," the girl said as at the sudden name of the king of gods the sky seemed to darken. "Are you fucking crazy? Don't say the Z word here. Do you want to get struck down?" I couldn't help but somewhat yell anxiously at the new camper. "But he is, he told me himself. I even have this, look," she said as she straightened her hand, and through my sight I could see how a small bolt of electricity materialized out of thin air in her palm and shot into the ground. "I am too young for this shit," I accidentally said aloud at seeing something which shouldn't have been possible. I mean, I had my fair share of power, but a child of Zeus was something which was banned. "Okay, just wait here," I said to the girl. I yelled towards the sky, "Skia. Ah, what the hell was that for?" the banned child questioned me. But I didn't pay attention to her as one of my ever-trustful crows came to my shoulder. I whispered into Skia's ear as she perched herself onto my shoulder, "Skia, go find Dad, tell him to meet me at the big house, we are in trouble." Skia responded in a happy tone, "Yes, master," and quickly flew away from our position. "Did you just talk to a crow?" the girl questioned me. Honestly, I was getting a bit tired of her questions. "Yes, but don't mind that. What was your name again?" I said while moving my hands rapidly and trying to keep our subject on track. "Me, I am Thalia Grace." The girl, "No, Thalia," said. "Okay Thalia, come with me, it is time to begin your tour and explain some stuff to you," I replied while flashing her a smile. "Hope you liked this chapter. Yeah, Thalia is at camp. You can take this as an O, but I already explained it in an auxiliary chapter as to why she is in camp earlier than the original plot, since it doesn't make sense how she is able to use a spear or manipulate the mist if she didn't go to camp before dying." Chapter 18, Questions. So many questions. Camp Half-Blood, October 28, 1998. "So how exactly does it work?" Thalia asked as she interrupted as I was guiding her through the divine cabins. "How does what work?" I asked her, tilting my head to the side since her question made no sense according to what I had been talking to. "Well, first of all, how are you be able to see? Aren't you blind? And second of all, is obviously you and your dad?" she said a little nervously, probably since she thought it would be a weird subject for me to talk about, which it kind of was, but nerved mind that. "Well, I am not truly blind. I can see things as you do, just that it all has different shades of black," I replied to her. "Oh, kind of like being color blind," she spouted as I finished my first thought. "Yeah, kind of, that would be the best way to put it," I replied. "As for me and my dad, I mean, it is pretty simple. I am adopted," I continued. "Wait, so does that mean you are unclaimed, and how come you were adopted?" she asked once again. I scratched the back of my nape and replied back, "Yeah, I guess I am unclaimed, and as for why I am adopted, the best reason I could give you is because I have been at camp since I was born, so my dad adopted me when I was just a baby, though you should ask him, I guess. But let's stop talking about me. After all, we have a tour to complete." I continued, guiding her through the rest of the common places like the dining pavilion, the archery range, the forge. Finally we arrived at the last stop of the tour, the big house. "Hi Mr. D," I said into thin air, at least that is what it looked like to me, but he, the non-alcoholic god of alcohol, should probably be there since he didn't leave his rocking chair except for, actually I couldn't remember even once where he wasn't sitting on his rocking chair or sleeping. Hey Oliver Seuss, another foolish hero with you I see, at least this one's someone pretty. Mr. D replied. After that Thalia and me entered the big house. Why did he call you that? I thought your name was Odysseus. Thalia questioned, whispering beside me. That is just how Mr. D is, he will never remember your actual name, so he will just give you something similar, at least that is what he says. I replied. We continued walking in silence with Thalia's occasional of the BJG house and its room until we reached the room I had been waiting for. I pushed open the door without knocking and said in a monotone voice, Dad, we need to talk. While Thalia walked closely behind me and she closed the office door behind us. Yes, that is what your crow said as well. My dad said back in his soothing voice. I decided to get this over with and just said it aloud, her dad is Zeus. I said matter of factly while staring at my dad's shadowy form. Well, isn't that curious? My dad said as he scratched his chin. What do you mean isn't that curious? Her dad is Zeus according to the pact between the big three, that shouldn't be possible. I said while slightly raising my voice at my father because of his nonchalant state, since this was a pretty big deal. Thalia, is this true? My dad said as he directed himself towards the girl at my side. Yeah, look. She replied back as she opened her palm and a small arch of lightning appeared on it and quickly shot into the roof, burning it slightly, which I could tell because of the smell of the smoke. Well, that is a problem now we have too. My dad said while scratching his beard. Wait, two as in two band children? I exclaimed at listening my dad's words. Yeah, her and you. My dad continued while pointing at Thalia and me consequently. Wait, what, I am not a child of the big three. I said in confusion towards my dad. Well son, my father started speaking but was suddenly interrupted by a yelling voice. Okay, could someone please explain what the hell you guys are you talking about? Thalia, my dear, please don't yell, and as for what we are talking about, it is just that according to a pact between the big three, Zeus your father, Poseidon and Hades, there was a unanimous decision for they to stop having children since they were growing too powerful, and that pact was made more than 60 years ago. My dad started explain towards Thalia. Okay, I get that, but then who is this guy's dad? She said as she pointed in my direction. Well, he hasn't been claimed and there is no definitive evidence, but I think that his godly parent is Hades, since he is able to manipulate shadows. My dad explained as he directed himself this time to me. But wait, I can't feel any connection towards death or have manipulated skeletons or bones, which is characteristic of Hades' kids like all of them. I countered against my dad's argument. Yes, that is why I said there is no definitive evidence. My dad said in a soothing manner. Then my dad could as well be Erebus, the primordial god of darkness and shadows. I jokingly talked back to my father. Don't be silly, Odysseus, there is no record of a child of a primordial ever being born, and you should know the reason as well as I do. My dad said, while Thalia just watched our interaction while turning head back and forth. Author note, gimme power stones. Also Thalia and Kyan are in the lead right now, so it will probably be one of the two. Chapter 19, The Story of Thalia and Odysseus. 3 months later. Camp Half-Blood, January 2, 1999. Stop dodging, you prick! Thalia shouted angrily while continuing to thrust her spear at me continuously while I dodged by a hair's breadth each strike from her spear. Nah Thalia, come on, you need to improve. I smirked at her continuously growing furious expression. Just stay still. She yelled as arc of an electricity spawned around her spear, which I quickly backdashed so as to dodge it. She then threw it at my face and I just bent backwards, letting the lightning pass over me, its temperature alone burning my hair tips slightly. Ugh! Thalia said as she saw my smirking face. Well, you had enough of a chance, it is my turn now. I smiled slightly, focusing on my Greek helmet tattoo on my right hand. I infused some mist through it and a spear started materializing in my hand while the tattoo slowly dissipated. Ah, how useful is this ability, isn't it, Thalia? I said while grinning. Okay, that is fucking unfair. Thalia said as she gaped at my materializing spear. Well, not my fault I got claimed by the Pelian spear, is it? I replied, while clenching my legs and smashing my back foot against the ground. I quickly appeared in front of Thalia and with all the force I could muster I lunged straight at her. It seemed that her training had been paying off as she barely dodged my strike, getting a scrape on her stomach. Come on, lightning girl, you are gonna have to be faster than that. She didn't reply at me but just gritted her teeth at my remark. I started dashing and lunging towards her. She tried blocking each of my strikes with her spear and distance herself with some of her lighting abilities. The sparring session continued as I slowly pressured her more and more, with a final large slap from the pole of my spear and I hit her on the head. She fell to the floor letting go of her spear and clutching her head. God damn it! She said angrily while sitting on the floor clutching her head. Hey, come on, don't worry about it, I got beat around for years before I started winning my spars. I said as I stretched out my hand to her fallen body. Come on, get up. We have Pegasus riding next. I continued. Okay, let's go. She replied as she grabbed my hand and I helped her up. 20 days later. Finally today's over. Thalia said, as we started walking back towards her cabin. Hey Thalia. I asked her. Yeah dude. Thalia replied. Happy birthday. I continued. Thalia then turned her face at me and said in an awkward manner, thanks Ozzy. See you tomorrow. She then walked and slowly entered Zeus' cabin. I then started walking back to bed while reflecting on the previous months. Thalia POV. I slowly closed the door of my father's cabin behind me, with a shot of adrenaline suddenly surging through me. It was honestly weird. After what Ozzy said I couldn't stop thinking about it, even though it was just a simple happy birthday. To try to get my mind off the subject I looked at my cabin where I had been staying for the last 3 months. Electric blue covered the walls and ceiling, tens of lighting arches that seemed to be constantly lighting distributed all around the ceiling. I looked at all the bunk beds around the cabin, probably because of all the kids my dad used to have. I climbed to one of the top beds and looked at the sky, but my head couldn't stop slightly drifting to the last thing Ozzy said. After that I started picturing our other training sessions and times together. Just go to sleep Thalia. I said aloud to distract myself and tried falling asleep. 4 months later. MCPOV. So are you guys ready for some pinochle? My dad said as he turned his head looking at me and something which I couldn't see. Mr. D. Yeah, come on dad, just deal the cards, I am definitely winning this one. I said. Ha kid, you shouldn't be so sure about that. The invisible god backed up. My dad simply smiled at the gods of wine and my quibbling. He started dealing the cards 3 at a time for each of us until all 3 of us had 12 cards each. My dad then flipped one final card showing the 8 of spades. We started playing the game, with most of the time the tricks being won by my dad, though I won a few as well. Dionysus on the other hand, the no-drunk alcoholic god, kept on losing and yelling about how this was also part of his curse. We continued playing. In 1 hour of playing my dad quickly reached the required 1000 points to win the game, while I just had 700 and Mr. D had 50 points. This game is stupid. Mr. D yelled as he got up from his chair and from what I could hear went back into the big house. Seriously, are you sure you aren't cheating? I asked my dad while I threw my remaining cards onto the table. Oh come on son, you know I would never do that. Chiron replied, I ain't so sure anymore, I mean we have never won once in a game that mainly relies on chance, that is a pretty suspicious. I jokingly said to my dad. Sorlos, my dad started saying, but was suddenly interrupted as my chair was gobbled up by my shadow and I fell to the floor with a loud thump. Hey, what the hell happened? My dad asked as he came closer and started touching the ground. I don't know, the chair just fell in. I replied as I started inspecting the floor with my dad. It feels as if it is inside my shadow. I couldn't help but say after a slight inspection. Can you try taking it out? My dad questioned me as he scratched his chin. No clue. I answered my dad. I placed my hand onto my own shadow and tried to feel out the chair. My sight suddenly zoned in and my hand phased through my shadow. That's cool. I couldn't help but say, as my hand rummaged through my shadow. I felt the cold texture of the wood on my hand. I grabbed the chair feeling as though it weighed almost nothing. I slowly took it out. The chair started phasing through the shadow once again and I quickly took the entire chair out of my shadow in no time flat. Well, that seems like an interesting ability. My dad said while inspecting both my shadow and myself. 2 months later. Hey Ozzy. I can understand them, I can understand them. Thalia said excitedly as she rushed at me. Who can you understand, Thalia? I asked her somewhat tiredly. The birds, your crows, I can speak to them. She excitedly said. Wait, what, you can? I asked her. Yeah, Corvus, Skia, Randy, and all other birds too. Thalia said as she finished talking. I could see how a flock of a lot of different types of birds suddenly started flying towards us from the forest. No fucking way. I said, mouth somewhat agape as I realized what she meant by all birds. Thalia, call them off, call them off. I started yelling at her from the side, imagining the 12 divine cabins dirted by the droppings of all the birds and the bad graces that would give us. Why? They are just little birds, she said, as she probably still couldn't see the bad situation this would lead to. Please just do it. I pleaded for her as the almost invisible pink aura flared around her. She replied fine. She let out a low breath and ordered in ancient Greek in a low whisper, Beta iota rho delta phi lambda upsilon beta alpha kappa, birds fly back. The flock of birds seemed to hear her as they started flying back to the woods. Oh, thank God. I let out a sigh of relief. Author note, I know it may be rushed, but Thalia's thing is just a crush. Votes Thalia, 24, Kyan, 19, Bianca, 7, Reina 4, Electrona, 3. One more thing before I go, we will get into juicy stuff pretty soon, that is why there were so many time skips in the C chapter. Chapter 20, It's My Turn. Uncount Place. I had gone to bed after a long day of practice. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a place which I hadn't been in a long time. Darkness, not like the one I usually saw, but absolute darkness, rummaging around in different directions. The darkness seemed to welcome my arrival as the rummaging stopped and millions of eyes with different sizes all started opening at the same time, inspecting me. Hello son, we meet again. A voice that seemed to come from all directions reverberated across the space. Yeah, hi dude, I don't know who you are, but I am pretty sure I am not your son. I said to the one of the biggest eyes in particular. You are, but that doesn't matter right now, you will find out in due time. Now you must go to the attic and find the oracle, she will give you what you need. The powerful, low-pitched voice reverberating once again through the infinite space we were in. Suddenly, before I could answer the all-encompassing voice, I sunk into the shadowy ground beneath me, and woke up jolting from my bed. Should I listen to the voice? I mean, it is weird, but what is the worst that could happen? I lightly said aloud before getting out of bed and leaving my room. I slowly climbed the creaking steps, after finally making it to the final floor. I opened the door to the attic, the creaking only growing louder the more I opened it. After fully opening the door, I could see through my sight a ton of different things ranging from books to ancient weapons. I couldn't help but think back to the last time I was here. 1 year ago. Dad, why are we going to the attic? I didn't receive a quest in my dreams or anything similar. I said to my dad walking in front of me. Don't worry son, we aren't here for a quest, it is just that you have improved a lot when it comes to wielding a spear, so I wanted to try something. My dad replied. Oh well, okay. I finished saying. When we finally made it into the attic, my sight picked up on an old mummy-looking skeleton which supposedly was the oracle standing at the back of the room. Come on Odysseus, over here. My dad said, jolting me out of my stupor. Yeah dad, coming. I said while walking towards him. Here it is. My dad said while pointing at an enclosed box. He slowly opened it, revealing a spear with one point head on each end. This here is the Pelian spear. It was once wielded by Achilles, one of my greatest students. It is said that no one else but him could wield it. And while many thought of that to be a myth, that was in fact one of the spear's abilities. Sadly, no one after Achilles' death was claimed by the spear, so no has been able to wield it since. I normally show this spear to demigods who have a lot of proficiency in the spear, but no one has been chosen by the spear. My dad said, finishing his explanation. So what do I have to do? I asked my dad. Simple, just try to grab it. If you can pick it up, then that means you are chosen. Simple, right? My dad said. I nodded my head at his words and walked to the spear. I extended my hand and tried grabbing the spear. As soon as my fingertips touched it, the spear started reacting. Slowly the spear started turning into different bands and crawling onto my right hand. They slowly started etching themselves into my hand, and I fell to the floor buckling in pain, since it felt as if threads of molten lava were being implanted into my hand. Goddamn dad, this is hurting like a bitch. I yelled in pain. Odysseus, language. My dad said, a little of worry evident in his voice even though his words didn't show it. What do you mean language? I am having a legendary spear erected into my fucking hand. I continued yelling. Odysseus, stop yelling, the process is over. My dad said, trying to calm me down. I looked towards my right hand and etched on it was the picture of a Greek helmet. Flashback ends. As I recalled that fond memory, I couldn't help but look towards my hand where my spear resided. While I was remembering the somewhat dramatic scene that had occurred over a year ago, my sight caught something. The mummified oracle slowly started moving from her chair and started walking towards me. Well, isn't that cool? How the hell is it moving though? It doesn't have muscles, probably through magic. I said aloud as I walked closer to the walking oracle. The mummified oracle stopped when it finally made it in front of me, then it opened its mouth slightly as smoke started coming out of her mouth. The smoke continued gathering and flowing until it finally made an image of my father's study room where I could see him reading a book. The figure of my dad opened its mouth and a distorted deep voice said. In dreams of shadows, his father speaks. Whispers of labors, 9 to achieve. On an 8-year path that he must brave. Alone, cursed soul seeks to save. Through trials echoing ancient lore. The journey unfolds, a quest evermore. Well, I guess I finally got a quest in on my birthday too. Who knows, maybe I will meet Kevin and Hugh after all, they haven't come back from their quest yet. Asterisk author note, 2 things I know, another short chapter, sorry only around 1000 words not including this. Now on to what I wanted to say. The abilities of the Pelion Spear. 1. Unwieldable, it isn't able to be wielded by anyone besides the user. 2. Indestructible, the spear like Achilles himself is indestructible. 3. Tattoo Spear, the user is able to de-summon the spear into the user's dominant hand and summon it back. It takes the form of a tattoo of a Greek helmet.
Thanks for listening.